I thought a nice starting point for this conversation is the thing that you're really known for is the relationship between money and happiness. And I thought it would be nice to just hear a little bit about how you got into that kind of work.
Yeah, so I got interested in money and happiness because I suddenly started making money. And this was like a shock to my system because I had spent most of my 20s in graduate school earning a PhD in social psychology and making just enough money to stay alive. And then I got hired at the age of 26 as a faculty member at the University of British Columbia, and I suddenly started making like the median adult income. And I was like, whoa, I have more money than I need to stay alive. What am I supposed to do with all of this? And so being a nerdy new PhD, I naturally turned to the scientific literature on happiness. And there I found about 1,000 studies kind of documenting the overall relationship between income and happiness. So this is what you see in news stories all the time. But I found surprisingly little guidance about, well, what should you actually do with that money in order to get the most happiness out of it? So my students and my collaborators and I began running studies to try to figure out, hey, what is it that we could do with money in order to get the most happiness out of it? And so that's kind of where this all began.
I love this. You guys are going to be so much happier in the next half hour. So happiness, I think, is like, it's a bit of an abstraction. And I was wondering if you could just say, like, what does that mean? When you talk about happiness, what does that actually mean?
Yeah. So, I mean, you can certainly find, like, memes and stuff of, like, happiness is a puppy, happiness is a cold beer. Happiness for scientists is not those things. Happiness to scientists is really three key components. So first off, we look at life satisfaction. So do you feel like you are living the kind of life that you want to have? We also look at positive emotions. So on kind of an average Tuesday, are you experiencing some joy, some contentment? Are you laughing? Are you smiling? We also look at negative emotions, and negative emotions are healthy. They are part of life. Everybody experiences them. But again, on the average Tuesday, we're going to see really happy people experiencing a lot more positive emotions than negative emotions. And so in my work, we're sort of measuring some constellation of those variables to try to capture this core component of what it feels like to be happy.
I love this. Okay, so I think when we talk about happiness, we think about it as something that we're pursuing as individuals. We tend to think of it as the pursuit of happiness as a somewhat self-centered activity. And your research shows that actually this isn't necessarily the case, that giving to other people is something that makes us happy. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that research, how you've studied this and what you've discovered.
Yeah, so this goes back to my early days at UBC when I was trying to figure out, how to get the most happiness out of money. And so one of the things that we did was we actually sent our research assistants out on campus armed with cash. And our research assistants literally walked up to people and handed them money. So they'd walk up to you maybe and hand you a $5 or a $20 bill and say, hey, we want you to spend this by the end of the day. But there was this little catch, which is that we told half the people they had to spend this money in a way that benefited somebody else. And we told half the people they had to spend this money in a way that benefited themselves. And this was basically determined by the flip of a coin. Then we called people back at the end of the day and surveyed them about their happiness. And what we discovered was that people who'd been assigned to spend this money on others ended up feeling happier that day compared to folks who'd been assigned to spend that same amount of money on themselves. And that was a small study conducted just here in Vancouver, Canada, but we've since replicated this effect in countries around the world. We've even found a sort of early version of this among toddlers. And so what this suggests is that actually being generous to others, using what we have to benefit other people, seems to be a more productive route to achieving happiness than focusing just on ourselves.
And just because I think this is really interesting, and also I have two toddlers, I have two 3-year-olds, could you just say like a little bit about how you study this with toddlers? I think it's a great story.
Yeah, so we, and the reason, like, you might ask, why would you bother trying to study this in toddlers. And part of the reason why is it's fun, but also we believed that this tendency to experience joy from giving to others might be kind of baked into human nature. And if that's the case, then it's really important to see if we can find this among really young children. And so luckily, one of Mandy's and my mutual friends, Kylie Hamlin, is a developmental psychologist who, if you talk to her and you start to design a study with her, she will switch into puppet voice. So she'll be like, and then the puppet should say, you know? And so we figured out this study that we could run with little kids interacting with puppets where the children had an opportunity to give to the puppet. Now, any parents in the audience might already notice a problem here, which is that 2-year-olds don't care very much about money. So we worked with like the toddler equivalent of gold, which of course is goldfish crackers. So we gave little kids a windfall of goldfish for themselves. And then we gave them the opportunity to give some of these goldfish away to a adorable puppet named Monkey. And we set this up very carefully, very scientifically, and had them videotaped and then had research assistants code their facial expressions to see how they were responding to each of these different conditions. And what we find is like, first off, we find the obvious, which is that toddlers love getting goldfish. They look pretty happy when you give them a windfall of goldfish for themselves. But what we see is they actually exhibit even higher levels of happiness when they get to give some of it away. Now, let me just say, if you're thinking about your own toddler and you're like, I don't think this is going to happen with Jimmy, like, it doesn't mean everybody all the time, every child in every situation always lights up when they give. It certainly depends a little bit on some key features of the situation. But to me, it's sort of a reassuring kernel of human nature that we do have this tendency to experience joy from sharing what we have.
I love this. And because I've known this for a long time, I know a lot about your research, and it's part of what I love about this is like, because I have 2 3-year-olds, they fight a lot, but I am like, oh, but they are innately interested in giving to one another. Science shows. So something that I really like from your research on money and happiness is the idea of buying time, and I try to apply this a lot in my own life. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about what that means and how you think about this concept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the idea here, the sort of fundamental idea, is that happiness is really all about what we do with the minutes and hours of our lives, right? And so using money to transform the way we're spending those minutes and hours, again, on a typical Tuesday, is sort of the fundamental goal. Now, if you think about it, daily life is filled with tasks that are not particularly joyful. And some of those we are just like inevitably stuck with. We can't get rid of everything. But some of them we genuinely could buy our way out of. And so what we've done in our research is to, for example, give people money and tell them how to spend it. And in one of these studies, we tell them to use money. We give them $40. We recruited adults at Science World here in Vancouver. We gave them $40 on one Saturday. We said, use this in a way that will buy yourself time. So buy your way out of a task that you hate doing, or just buy yourself some more free time that you can do with what you please. And then another weekend we said, here's $40, and we told them to buy a material thing that they wanted. And what we discovered was that people felt happier when they used that money to buy time. Similarly, we find that adults around the world, we've surveyed thousands of adults, we find that folks who use money to buy time are happier than those who do not. And I mean, I will admit, that's not especially shocking. What is perhaps more surprising is that many people do not do this. In fact, even when we survey high net worth individuals, what we find is many of them are not using money to buy themselves time in a typical month. So my little piece of low-hanging fruit for happiness here is like to just take a second and think, is there a task you hate doing, maybe that fills you with dread, maybe you procrastinated on it, you do not enjoy it when you're doing it, it does not give you any satisfaction? Ask yourself, could you buy your way out of it? And I am here as a happiness researcher to tell you this is an effective and underutilized strategy to buying happiness.
I love this. So something that you just said that struck me is that people don't do this, which kind of suggests like we're not always great at predicting what will make us happy. And I'm wondering why. Like, what's going on with that?
Yeah. I mean, we certainly feel like we know what will make us happy, right? We all have a lot of predictions, theories. You could think about just sort of your daily behavior as perhaps to some extent a reflection of your own theory about what matters for your happiness. But it turns out this is actually a pretty hard problem to solve, even for us with all the tools of science. Like, you've got to work pretty hard to isolate what really matters for happiness. And one reason why it can be difficult for people to predict what matters for their happiness is simply that whatever we happen to be thinking about looms large. So for example, if people are thinking about getting a big promotion versus not, that can kind of stand out in their minds as something that's going to make such a big difference for their happiness. And what we find is that people consistently overestimate the impact of any one outcome, even a major life outcome, on their happiness. I think one of the fundamental truths that we've learned about happiness is that in a way, the good feelings that come from a really wonderful event do not last as long as we might anticipate. So for example, there is evidence that after people get married, they do get happier, but that happiness boost lasts on average for about 2 years. Now, that doesn't mean like if you went to your best friend's wedding 2 years ago that you should send them a little note being like, sorry, all the marital bliss is over. Like, these are averages, and obviously there's a huge amount of variability, but the broader lesson here is that nothing necessarily makes us happy forever. And so when we expect any one thing, and that could be a huge career success, meaning the person of your dreams, whatever it might be, moving somewhere else, it's unlikely to provide happiness that just lasts forever. The flip side of that, though, let me get to the good part of this, is that when something bad happens, we can feel like, I'm never going to be happy again. And I will tell you, that's basically not true for anything. Like, we see people just bounce back from almost everything. And I think there's an interesting misconception of human fragility that is out there that I see among my students sometimes now, where they think like, oh, I can't handle this. I'm going to be miserable if this thing happens. And it's like, no, humans are designed to bounce back. And when I say designed, it's like our emotional systems need to be able to respond to changing conditions. Our emotions exist in order to provide us with a guide, and a guide isn't useful if it never ever changes. If we were all lastingly happy, that would actually be kind of a problem. As my PhD advisor put it, he would always ask us, which now looking back seems kind of weird, but he would say, why don't we have orgasms that last 12 hours long? And the reason why is that burst of good feeling has done its job, right? And you can move on with your day and like find some food and do some other things, right? And so positive emotions aren't meant to last forever. They wouldn't be useful as a guide if they did, but this also means that we don't want to put all of our stock in kind of one thing and expect that to deliver us with lasting happiness. We also can comfort ourselves, and if you're facing something that's really hard, knowing that it's not going to provide lasting misery either.
It's really convenient being friends with Liz. When my parents got divorced, I told my dad about this, and it was incredibly comforting to him, knowing like actually most people are just going to go back to as happy as they were in the beginning. So with all of this in mind, I'm curious about like, what is it that very happy people have in common?
Yeah, so this is really fascinating to me. So we can go out and survey thousands of people, give them those kinds of measures of happiness that I told you about at the beginning, and then find the people who score at the top. Like, we could do this in this room, right? Like, figure out who are the happiest people and then go, okay, what is it that makes them special? What is it that they all have in common? And the short answer to this question is not much. In fact, there are many, many different ways to be happy. There are so many different pathways. In fact, there seems to be just one thing that very happy people pretty consistently all have in common, and that is strong social relationships. So very happy people doesn't necessarily mean the same kind of relationship. Strong social relationships can take many different forms, but this seems to be sort of like a prerequisite for very high levels of happiness. And so I think this is a really important thing to consider as we're kind of contemplating trade-offs in our everyday lives is that like this is really the one thing, like you've got to have that in place. And so really trying to prioritize those social relationships is probably the best thing you can do for your own happiness.
And if we as individuals wanted to have more experiences of social connection in our lives, are there things that we can do to make that possible in like a daily way?
Yeah, I mean, so one fun thing I think that is relevant to this situation and what we've kind of been hearing about in some of the preceding talks is just taking that time to have a conversation with somebody, right? And I mean, I found this too in one of the last breaks. I was getting some texts. I have a lot going on at work. I was very tempted to retreat into my phone. And then I thought, wait, I'm surrounded by all of these interesting people. Like there's somebody in this room who would be like an amazing new friend or just somebody that I would love to have a conversation with. I am going to put my phone down. I'm going to go walk around and meet people. And sure enough, like I had these amazing conversations. I'm just looking around at some of the people that I met. And so that is something, you know, just a really small, concrete thing that we can do, not only because you never know who that sort of next cool, awesome friend is going to be, but also because in my work, we show that, you know, even taking the time to chat with the barista at your local Starbucks actually increases people's feelings of positive mood and even their sense of belonging in their community relative to just sort of being efficient, getting in and getting out with their coffee. And so just adding that extra little dose, just like pushing yourself to be a little more sociable than you feel inclined to be, seems to elevate feelings of happiness and feelings of connection. And you might feel like you're imposing on somebody else, but actually what research shows is that when you do that, you're actually creating a contagious form of happiness. You are brightening somebody else's day. So it's like, if you take that extra step, put your phone down, connect with somebody else in this room, you're doing something pro-social and helping that person too.
Okay, but what if you're an introvert?
Well, what's interesting is that introverts don't want to do this. It doesn't sound appealing.
That's me.
Yeah, but study after study shows that introverts actually get just as big a mood boost from this as extroverts do. So even though it might feel unappealing, it seems to work. And you know, obviously there are limits to this. I'm not saying all day, every day, you've got to go out and do this, right? That could be exhausting and overwhelming. I think it's especially when we find ourselves in spaces like this, right? Where it's worth kind of pushing out of that comfort zone if you are an introvert going, I'm going to pretend to be an extrovert today. And in fact, in studies where introverts are told to pretend to be extroverts, they actually end up feeling happier. It doesn't mean don't be true to yourself, be inauthentic, but just, again, once in a while, just trying that out. And you can walk into this room and be a different person if you want to be, right? And just even trying that out for a day and seeing what it feels like.
I think about this particular idea a lot because I'm a little bit shy, and I try to remind myself, like, I will be a happier person. I will have a stronger sense of belonging if I bother to just chat with people. And I love this concept. It feels very true to me. So on the subject of social connection, I know you're in the midst of some research on AI and social connection, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so one of my graduate students studying Invoke back in 2019 wanted to do some research on chatbots. And I, in my infinite wisdom as the professor, was like, chatbots? That seems like a niche topic. I don't think anyone's interested in those. But he convinced me that this could actually be interesting, so we started doing some studies. At the time, you know, chatbots were not nearly at the level that they are now, so we used what's called the Wizard of Oz method, where we made people think they were interacting with a chatbot, but really it was a human controlling it. So we basically created like ChatGPT level chatbots using undergraduate RAs who were kind of hidden behind the scenes. So we were able to start studying these effects before the technology kind of caught up. And one of the things that we discovered, and we've since replicated this effect with actual, you know, modern chatbots, is that people can get real feelings of social connection from engaging with chatbots. And this is actually a controversial topic in the academic literature right now. Some prominent scholars have argued that, you know, just knowing that AI is saying these words demolishes any potential for connection because we know that AI doesn't have a mind, or at least most people believe that AI doesn't have a mind. We find that's wrong. People just bypass that concern with amazing alacrity. Like they're just like, yeah, it's fine. You know, we're really good at seeing minds where they don't exist. And so what we find is that in the short term, people do seem to get this boost from interacting with chatbots. And this is particularly the case, like if your alternative option is to text like your brother who doesn't respond in the way that you love, you may find you get a bigger mood boost and a greater feeling of connection from telling a chatbot instead about the great time that you had at this conference today. Now, of course, you can imagine there's a little bit of a darker side to that, too. And we see in a recent survey we did of frequent users of a popular social chatbot called Replica, 60% of them told us that they use Replica as a replacement for human relationships, which is a little frightening. And we've subsequently, this is actually, you all are going to be the first audience to hear about this because we're just publishing this work now, but we have followed people for an 8-month period as they begin to adopt chatbots and use them for sort of social companionship. And what we see is that when people are feeling lonelier, they subsequently turn to chatbots for a feeling of connection. But unfortunately, over the long term, engaging more with chatbots, relying on them more for companionship, actually seems to exacerbate feelings of loneliness. So while we're kind of thinking of social chatbots, and this is preliminary, we're still figuring it out, but we're thinking of chatbots as being a little bit like social junk food, where it's satiating in the moment, but over time it may actually undermine people's feelings of social satisfaction. And so again, all brand new ideas, we're still investigating them, but pretty interested to see and try to understand, you know, where this is all going to go. And in saying this, you know, I want to be clear, it doesn't mean that chatbots could never be a force for positive connection. It simply means that the way people are using chatbots right now may actually be counterproductive in creating connection.
This is fascinating. Thank you for saying a little bit about that. Before we run out of time, there's one more thing that I really want us to talk about, which is that I know you're working on a book right now about happiness and climate change. And I think those are two things that we don't often think of as going together. And so I was wondering if you could tell us how this is something that you decided to get into.
Yeah, so I was biking to my lab at UBC one day, thinking about climate change, as you do. And I was thinking how it's kind of a bummer that my life's work on happiness has no bearing whatsoever on one of the most important existential challenges of our time, namely climate change. And then I started thinking about biking, and I bike to work because I arrive in a better mood than if I drive. And then I started thinking about many of the other kinds of sustainable behaviors that we need to shift to, and that actually these are helpful in supporting happiness. And so it just so happens that one of my colleagues at UBC is among the world's leading experts on the behavioral side of climate change. We had a faculty meeting that day, so I like beelined for her with a kind of crazy look in my eye, like, I've got to tell you this idea. And she says she had kind of a light bulb moment where she realized, like, oh, happiness has been missing from the climate change conversation. It's all about shame and guilt and fear. But in fact, there's actually this beautiful sense of possibility of a much happier and lower carbon world that we can create. And so we're trying to sort of recenter this conversation to think about the role of happiness in fighting climate change. And that's the new book we're working on right now, Zhang Zhao and I. It's tentatively entitled The Joy of Climate Change, which people either love or hate. That's fine. Our editor at Penguin Random House likes that it's a love or hate thing. But if you have thoughts on this, happy to chat and connect.
So biking is an interesting example of something that like hits that sweet spot between happiness and being like a low carbon activity compared to, say, driving. And I think it can be hard to kind of conceptualize what other things we could do that could make us happier while also making us better citizens of the world when it comes to climate. And I was wondering if you could, I know you talk about a bunch of different domains in the book. One of them is like food, which I think is an interesting example. How can we think about food when it comes to climate and happiness?
Yeah. And I know we need to wrap up, so I'll just say briefly, I think, there's been a message that I think has become sort of like the dominant message that like, oh, we should become vegan to deal with climate change. And if you are a vegan, God bless you, like that's awesome. Right now, less than 1% of folks are vegan, and so we can't really expect vegans to save the world alone. I think often when people think about giving up the foods that they love, this entails a sense of sacrifice and sadness. And so one thing that we encourage people to do is to think about those really high carbon foods that you might love, whether that's steak or lamb, thinking about, instead of giving it up completely, thinking about having it a little bit less often. And what my research has demonstrated is that when we take our favorite things and actually have them a little less often, we renew our capacity to really enjoy them. And so sort of elevating these high carbon foods, not to say that they are evil or that you are a bad person if you enjoy them, but rather that this is something we should elevate as a special experience that is saved for special occasions, and sort of find extra joy in these things, and that we can use sort of cutting back on things as actually an opportunity to think about happiness rather than just scarcity. So maybe, I know time is scarce, so maybe we should stop there, but happy to connect with people further and hear more about any thoughts and ideas that folks have.
Great. Thank you so much.